Now, there are a couple of problems I have with this. First, human identity is a divine creation. Human identity is a divine creation. We have numerous passages in Scripture that support this view. And I would say it is integral, necessary, for any sort of coherent view on Christian or Jewish theology, the idea that God is invested in the individual human life, and that God was invested in the individual human life in the act of creating it. If we do not have this, if we do not have this as a baseline from which we operate, none of the rest of it really makes sense. We cannot have the crucifixion as being even remotely meaningful. We cannot have the transmission of Scripture as being meaningful if there is not original investment. And Scripture speaks to this point. The second issue I have with absolute depravity is that it is not, strictly speaking, scriptural. Now, Augustine of Hippo, the person who originally drafted this concept, recognized this later in his career, recognized this, and sought to clarify, and in particular address the ambiguities in the verses of Paul where he originally got the idea that he just flat out ignored when he originally came up with the concept. And that decision on the part of Augustine, that kind of reversal of his position, was later ratified and validated at Second Trent. At Second Trent, the Roman Catholic Church decided, ruled through long deliberation in ecumenical council, that the original concept of absolute depravity was irreconcilable with the notion of a human being who was capable of accepting salvation. And as such, the concept was heretical. It was deemed heretical. And his later views ratified. This, incidentally, makes Augustine of Hippo the only man in Christian history who is both a saint and a heretic. Now, the original verses, the verses that Augustine was drawing from to draft the idea of absolute depravity, are almost exclusively written by Paul. And he was very selective in the way that he approached Paul, as he recognized later in his career. Because when Paul is talking about the depraved will, the evil of human will, he talks about it as one aspect of human identity. One aspect. As he describes a will that is opposed to God, he is also describing a will that seeks unity, that seeks reconciliation with God. And here we find that Paul, in his original writing, is far closer to an accurate reflection of human nature than many people who have drafted ideas very loosely based on his work. And that brings me to my third objection, which is the human will is not a single agent. Human will is not unified. When we say that the human will is absolutely evil, we are necessarily describing a will that is never at conflict with itself, or at the very least, wherein the results of that conflict are predictable, absolutely predictable. Or, at the very least, the proposition that a will that is at conflict is inherently evil, that conflict is inherently evil. Now, with all three of these propositions, we have problems, both from a philosophical view and a strictly scriptural view. First, the notion that human will is entirely evil and is incapable of making a correct decision begs the question of how this entirely depraved will is capable of accepting salvation. And this was the point upon which the Ecumenical Council based their ruling at Second Trent. Second, the idea that human will and the conflict within it will always result in evil, even as it is conflicted, begs the question of how we can say it is conflicted if it universally produces evil. And that brings us back to the first point. On the third point, the idea that a will at conflict, that good resisting evil is inherently evil, strikes me as absolutely absurd, because at that point we are saying that it is an evil thing for good to resist evil. Now, regarding the conflict of will, I like to go to Schelling, who proposed a workable model for this problem. He describes human will as being divided between a light will and a dark will. Now, the light will and the dark will are not classic good and evil, but rather the dark will is simply the will that operates in ignorance of self and self as existing in context, and the light will is the will which operates with a knowledge of self, a knowledge of context, and in a theistic view, a knowledge of oneself as a divine creation. Now, in Schelling's view, the conflict between these is not one of mutual annihilation. The dark will ultimately operates without any goals at all. It does not have the necessary self-apprehension, the self-perception, to form coherent goals, but rather operates more like a storm, or a school of piranha. It just devours what is within reach. The light will, on the other hand, does not seek to annihilate or destroy the dark will, but rather to inform it. The dark will operates as it does because of its ignorance of itself, its context, and its created status. And the light will must dialogue with, engage with the dark will, and inform it as to its real nature. The beauty of this view is that I don't think we actually need to keep the dualism that Schelling proposed for the rest of the model to be workable. We don't need to have a light will, a dark will, in order for this to work. But we can operate more from a general idea of good as informed by self-knowledge, and in particular self-knowledge as a created being, which implies awareness of the Creator. We also find that Schelling's definition for evil works very, very well in the classical Christian context. We go to Milton's Satan, for example, as Satan who believes in utter ignorance that he is capable of a clearer perception and clearer plan for creation than God himself. Sin, in this context, is a creation of, or product of, a union between arrogance and ignorance. So, bringing this all home to the Christian, your identity is an intentional creation. It is something that was purposely constructed by God. It is not some random collection of experience impacting a recollective or resonant membrane where some things stick and some things don't, and what does and doesn't is purely arbitrary. There is intentionality behind it. And in this view, to sin is to obscure or to mar the person that God intended you to be. And in this we find that once again we're going back to a classical Christian definition for Satan, because to sin, to commit evil, is to extend your authority beyond its proper bounds, to attempt to supersede the authority of God, in that you are trying to remake the self in such a way that it is at conflict with the self that God created and the self that God intended. And with this, sin is not a punitive concept. Sin is not an excuse for punishment, but rather a safeguard, a protection that stands between unbound, random, and arbitrary decision and our all too damageable selves, our all too damageable identities. And while it's been proposed before that the law was there to protect us from the practical damage done by sin, I'd say that the more substantial damage caused by sin is how it impedes our perception, how it impedes our capacity to truly self-define, going back, way back, to the idea that a sinful act is one that will ultimately undermine our capacity to choose. And that this more abstract sort of damage is actually the one that has the greater impact in our day-to-day living. What we find in this view is that sin is a safeguard to protect us from a sort of damage that will ultimately impede our capacity to even perceive ourselves as damaged. And how much greater, then, is the impediment to our ability to heal and to be made whole.